The slow disappearance of self-respect did not remember the exact moment it began. No one ever does. Self-respect rarely disappears in a single dramatic collapse. It erodes quietly, patiently, almost politely. It fades in the background of daily life, disguised as kindness, adaptability, and the desire to belong. By the time a person notices it is gone, the world has already adjusted to their absence. In his early years, he was known as a good child. That word followed him everywhere good. Teachers used it with approval. Relatives repeated it with pride. Neighbors smiled when they spoke it. Good meant obedient. Good meant quiet. Good meant agreeable. Good meant easy. He learned early that approval came not from expressing himself, but from managing himself, from sensing what others wanted before they had to ask, from suppressing impulses that might cause discomfort, tension, or disapproval. When he complied, faces softened, voices warmed. When he resisted, even slightly, something subtle shifted in the room, an invisible pressure that taught him resistance had consequences. No one called it conditioning. They called it manners. At home, emotions were tolerated only when they were convenient. Anger was seen as disrespect. Sadness was treated as weakness. Curiosity was welcomed only when it did not challenge authority. He learned to observe moods before speaking. He learned to edit his words mid-thought. He learned that silence was safer than honesty. The mind adapts quickly when safety is at stake. By the time he reached adolescence, self-censorship had become automatic. He did not experience it as suppression. It felt like maturity. While others expressed frustration or disagreement openly, he learned to smile and nod. He became the listener, the mediator, the reliable one. People praised his patience. They admired his calm. What they did not see was the internal negotiation happening before every response. A constant calculation. Will this upset them? Will this make me less likable? Is it worth the risk? Over time, the calculations became reflexive. The pauses grew shorter. The cost of speaking felt heavier. In school, he noticed patterns before he understood them. The louder students commanded attention even when they were wrong. The disruptive ones were remembered. The compliant ones blended into the background. He belonged to the background. Teachers trusted him but rarely noticed him. Classmates liked him but rarely respected him. Respect, he would later realize, was not given to those who caused no friction. It was given to those who occupied space without apology. At the time, he did not question this. He assumed respect was something that arrived later, something earned through effort, kindness, and patience. He believed that if he remained good long enough, the world would eventually recognize his value. That belief followed him quietly into adulthood. In his early professional life, he carried the same patterns like inherited furniture, familiar, unquestioned, heavy. He arrived early. He stayed late. He volunteered for tasks others avoided. He apologized instinctively, even when he was not at fault. His tone remained polite even when his boundaries were crossed. At first, it worked. Supervisors appreciated his reliability. Colleagues leaned on his willingness. He became indispensable, which felt like validation. But indispensability is a dangerous substitute for respect. It rewards availability, not authority. It values compliance, not presence. Gradually, expectations shifted. Requests became assumptions. Appreciation became silence. His time stopped being negotiated and started being consumed. When he hesitated, confusion followed. When he declined, disappointment appeared. He noticed something unsettling. The more accommodating he became, the less seriously his words were taken. Meetings passed where his ideas were acknowledged politely, then ignored. Decisions were made without consulting him, even in areas he managed. Jokes were made at his expense, harmless, casual, deniable. He laughed along, because that was what he had always done. Inside, a quiet discomfort began to form. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was a dull awareness that something was wrong, paired with the inability to name it. He felt overlooked, yet guilty for feeling that way. He felt disrespected, yet unsure whether he deserved better. This is how self-respect dissolves, not through humiliation, but through confusion. He began to internalize the treatment. When others interrupted him, he spoke faster. When they dismissed his concerns, he softened his tone. When boundaries were crossed, he justified it as misunderstanding. Each adjustment felt small. Each compromise felt temporary. But patterns do not reset themselves outside of work. Similar dynamics emerged. Friendships revolved around his availability. Conversations centered on others' problems. When he needed support, responses were delayed, distracted, or shallow. People assumed he would understand. He always did. Romantic relationships followed the same invisible script. He invested deeply, listened intently, adapted constantly. He avoided conflict to preserve harmony. He feared that asserting his needs would make him difficult, demanding, replaceable. What he did not realize was that by making himself endlessly flexible, he had become indistinct. Self-respect does not vanish because others take it away. It disappears because a person slowly stops defending it. Late at night, alone with his thoughts, he sometimes wondered why he felt unseen despite being surrounded by people. Why exhaustion followed him even on quiet days. Why resentment surfaced without a clear target. He searched for external explanation: stress, bad timing, unfair circumstances. He never considered that the problem might be internal, systemic. No one had taught him what self-respect actually was. He assumed it meant confidence, arrogance, dominant traits he had been subtly trained to avoid. He did not know that self-respect is quieter than ego and stronger than confidence. That it begins not with how one is seen, but with what one tolerates. At this stage, he was still blind to the core issue. He sensed the consequences, but not the cause. He believed the solution lay in trying harder, being better, becoming more valuable. So he tried. And with every attempt to earn what should never have been negotiated, his self-respect slipped further out of reach. He did not realize that effort, when driven by fear, does not build worth. It erodes it. The harder he tried to be useful, the more invisible he became. The more he adjusted himself to fit expectations, the less anyone felt the need to adjust for him. What once felt like cooperation slowly transformed into self-erasure. But because it happened gradually, it never triggered alarm. It felt normal, familiar, safe. Safety, after all, had always been his currency. As a child, safety came from approval. As an adult, it came from predictability. He knew what was expected of him: be reasonable, be available, be understanding. These qualities were praised in words, but punished in outcomes. They earned him dependence, not regard; need, not respect. Yet he continued, because walking away from a pattern learned in childhood feels like betrayal. Of others, yes, but more painfully, of the version of oneself that survived by adapting. He told himself stories to justify the imbalance. He believed that people were simply unaware, that if he communicated more clearly, things would change, that his patience would eventually be rewarded. These beliefs were comforting because they postponed confrontation with others and with himself. Confrontation would have required him to admit a frightening possibility: that he had taught people how to treat him, not through words, but through repetition. Every time he stayed silent to avoid discomfort, he sent a message. Every time he apologized unnecessarily, he sent another. Every time he accepted less than he gave, he reinforced a rule. The rule was simple. His boundaries were flexible, negotiable, secondary. Once a rule is learned, it is rarely questioned. He noticed how differently people behaved around those who carried themselves with quiet certainty. They were not louder. They were not cruel. They were simply unyielding in subtle ways. Their time was respected. Their opinions carried weight. Their absence was felt. No one announced their authority. It existed without explanation. He admired these individuals from a distance, assuming they were born that way, confident, secure, untouched by doubt. It never occurred to him that confidence might be a result, not a cause, that it might grow from repeated acts of self-respect rather than personality. The thought that self-respect was a practice, not a trait, had never been presented to him. When conflict arose, his instinct was always to soften. He chose words carefully, diluted his concerns, framed his needs as suggestions. He believed this made him mature. In reality, it made him negotiable. People listened, nodded, then did what they had already intended to do. Each small dismissal accumulated, not dramatically, but persistently. Like water wearing down stone, the effect was undeniable over time. His internal dialogue began to shift. He questioned his own reactions. He wondered if he was too sensitive. He blamed himself for feeling undervalued. Self-respect does not disappear all at once. It fragments. One fragment is the loss of trust in one's perceptions. Another is the normalization of discomfort. A third is the belief that asserting oneself is selfish. By the time these fragments are scattered, the original structure is difficult to recognize. He began to feel disconnected from his own desires. When asked what he wanted, he hesitated not because he lacked preferences, but because he had learned to suppress them before they reached awareness. Wanting felt dangerous. Wanting risked disappointment, conflict, rejection. So he wanted less, or pretended to. There were moments, brief, sharp, when clarity pierced through the fog. A meeting where his contribution was ignored, then repeated by someone else and praised. A friend who canceled plans without explanation, assuming forgiveness. A partner who dismissed his concerns as overthinking. In those moments, something tightened in his chest, a sensation that hovered between anger and grief. But the feeling passed quickly, overridden by habit. He rationalized. He minimized. He adapted. Adaptation had once protected him. Now it imprisoned him. Late one evening, after a long day that offered no clear reason for exhaustion, he sat alone in silence. No distractions, no conversations to manage, no expectations to meet, just stillness. And in that stillness, an unfamiliar question surfaced, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. When did this become acceptable? He did not yet know what he was asking, only that something fundamental had been compromised, something he had never consciously agreed to surrender. Self-respect had not been taken from him. It had been traded slowly, unknowingly, for approval, safety, and belonging. The realization unsettled him, because it suggested that the problem was not external. And if the problem was internal, then the solution would require change. Real change, the kind that threatens identity. For the first time, he sensed that the life he was living was built on rules he had never chosen. Rules learned early, reinforced often, and obeyed without question. This was not yet awakening. It was the discomfort that precedes it. And discomfort, unlike fear, has a way of demanding attention. He began to observe patterns everywhere, like a silent investigator uncovering evidence he had always ignored. Conversations, interactions, even casual gestures, each revealed a consistent principle. People treated him according to the limits he had set, knowingly or unknowingly. Those limits were invisible, yet powerful. They dictated how far others could lean into his life, how much attention they would grant, how often his needs were considered. At first, he resisted seeing it. The mind prefers comfort over clarity. Accepting the truth meant admitting responsibility not only for the erosion of respect, but for the unwitting role he had played in teaching it. In social gatherings, he noticed it in subtle ways. Friends interrupted him mid-sentence, yet he smiled and adjusted his tone. Colleagues took credit for ideas he had carefully nurtured, yet he nodded politely, finding excuses for their behavior. Even strangers, those who knew nothing of him, responded to an aura of self-erasure. He realized that self-respect is not about what one commands externally, but what one allows internally. It begins with small permissions: the right to speak, to pause, to refuse. Each act of self-denial, no matter how minor, reinforced a culture of invisibility around him. During these realizations, guilt surfaced. He felt selfish for wanting boundaries. He felt difficult for asking to be seen. And yet, beneath the guilt, a seed of recognition began to grow. Respect is not a favor granted. It is a consequence of the respect one demonstrates toward oneself. Memory drifted back to childhood moments. The first time he had spoken up, only to be silenced softly, almost kindly. The first time he had demanded attention, only to be told it was inappropriate. At each step, he had internalized the lesson: accommodation over assertion, compliance over expression, survival over authenticity. Now, decades later, those lessons had calcified into default behavior. Survival remained, but authenticity was lost. Every act of yielding reinforced the notion that he was secondary, negotiable, and replaceable. And yet, He observed a stark contrast in others who seemed to carry invisible authority effortlessly. These individuals did not raise their voices unnecessarily. They did not manipulate or dominate. They did not ask for respect, they embodied it. Their presence alone commanded attention. Their calm, unwavering boundaries created an aura that drew others toward them without effort or demand. He wondered why he had never noticed before that self-respect could be silent, that it did not require performance, compliance, or approval seeking, that it could exist without proving worth to anyone but oneself. A subtle shame emerged. For years, he had equated respect with achievement, with recognition, with being noticed. Now he began to understand that true respect comes from alignment between action, intention, and internal standards. When alignment falters, people notice not the individual, but the gaps they project. He began to trace the moments when he had unconsciously abdicated his boundaries, invitations he accepted out of obligation, apologies he offered out of fear, efforts he doubled to make others comfortable. Each was a brick in a structure that had begun to isolate him, even as it made him indispensable. By the end of the week, he saw the cumulative effect. Every interaction carried subtle cost-benefit calculations, all skewed in favor of others' comfort at the expense of his own. Each concession diminished a fraction of his self-regard. Each adjustment communicated, "I am available, not essential." It was quiet, incremental, nearly invisible. Yet, when he considered the whole, the erosion was unmistakable. He realized that reclaiming self-respect would not be a single act, a dramatic confrontation, or a speech. It would require careful observation, deliberate choices, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort. It would require undoing decades of internalized accommodation, piece by piece for the first time. He did not feel frustration or despair. He felt awareness. Awareness is a strange companion, heavy with responsibility, yet liberating in its clarity. It does not provide immediate solutions, but it illuminates the path. And on that path, he understood a vital truth. The world does not take notice of passive worth. Respect is never granted automatically. It is earned, first internally, then externally. If one fails to cultivate it within, no amount of external effort can compensate, even in solitude. He sensed the silent presence of those early lessons, the echoes of childhood voices, the subtle nods and corrections, the gentle reprimands. He recognized their role in shaping his behavior, but he also recognized their impermanence. The past had influenced him, yes, but it did not have to define him. He imagined a life where his boundaries were recognized without apology, where his words carried weight without aggression, where his presence demanded acknowledgement simply because he allowed it. The thought was unsettling, thrilling, and for the first time in years, imaginable. It was the beginning of awareness, not mastery, but it was enough. Awareness had cracked open the first window of possibility. Through it, he glimpsed a self he had almost forgotten existed, a self capable of silent strength, deliberate action, and unshakable alignment between intention and presence. As he sat there in quiet reflection, he realized that self-respect, once fully understood, was not a reward. It was a choice, a daily practice, an unwavering commitment to honor one's own presence, values, and limits, even when the world does not notice. And so, in that quiet moment, he decided, not with loud declarations, not with dramatic gestures, but with calm, deliberate recognition, that the path forward would be defined by the choices he made for himself, not by the approvals he sought from others. The slow disappearance of his self-respect had revealed a critical lesson. It could be reclaimed, but only through conscious action, awareness, and the courage to uphold boundaries that had long been invisible. He understood that reclaiming self-respect would not be simple. It would not arrive in a single act of defiance, nor in a single decision to assert himself. It would be cumulative, built from small, deliberate choices repeated daily, until they formed patterns strong enough to shift the world's perception and, more importantly, his own. He began to reflect on the subtleties of his interactions, the unconscious concessions he had made. For decades, invitations he accepted reluctantly, words he softened unnecessarily, ideas he abandoned before they were even fully formed, all were small agreements to diminish his own value in the eyes of others. Each act had been invisible, Yet together they created a life in which his presence was expected but rarely valued. In revisiting these memories, he noticed the recurring motif. He had always equated silence with safety. In his family, in school, in early friendships, quiet compliance had been rewarded with smiles, praise, and fleeting moments of approval. But over time, compliance became expectation. Approval faded into indifference. Safety, it turned out, was a thin veil over invisibility. He also saw how easily his empathy had been weaponized not intentionally by others, but inevitably. His willingness to accommodate, to anticipate others' needs, to soften his words to avoid conflict, had made him reliable, yes, but replaceable. People depended on his predictability. They did not depend on his judgment, his creativity, his insight. His presence became a service, not a presence. At work, at home, in social circles. The pattern was unmistakable. The quiet ones are often treated as invisible, the compliant ones as expendable. He had lived through this, and only now did he recognize the cumulative toll it had taken. What had once felt like humility now appeared as self-erasure. What had once felt like kindness now appeared as invisibility.